Olá, muito boa noite. Começa aqui mais uma edição do programa Pertinente da Fundação Francisco Manuel dos Santos, programa dedicado a grandes entrevistas com personalidades internacionais da política, economia e sociedade. Hoje vamos ter connosco Peter Frankopan, um conceituado historiador, professor e autor inglês, cuja especialidade é a História. Ele é professor de História Global na Universidade de Oxford, no Reino Unido, e o seu foco é principalmente a Rússia, o Médio Oriente, a China, a Ásia Central. Frankopan escreveu vários livros, mas destaco dois que receberam vários prémios e deram notoriedade internacional: The Silk Roads e The New Silk Roads, obras que falam na importância global dos impérios do Este, tanto no passado como também no presente e futuro. Durante a próxima meia hora iremos falar sobre o papel da China na luta pela supremacia económica global. Vamos falar também da influência da Rússia, de Putin, na política e economia europeia e vamos ver também o ponto de situação no Médio Oriente e a influência que esta zona do planeta também tem no balanço do poder global. Vamos então começar a nossa conversa com o Peter, que está em Oxford. Peter, thanks so much for joining us. Pleasure to have an opportunity to speak with you, especially during times where it feels every week there's a new play from East or West to try to gain some kind of momentum for superiority. We'll get into those specific cases in just a moment, but let's start with your books, because not only were they very successful commercially, but they were particularly insightful in bringing to the public conversation, really, something which had happened throughout history, and you being a history professor know all about it, of course, which is the importance of the empires of the East, the importance of certain political regimes that we in the West sometimes don't pay that much attention to. So before my first question becomes way too long, I wanted to ask you about the old Silk Roads, the new Silk Roads, what affinities there are between the two, and the impacts they are having in their respective eras.
Well, thanks, Pedro, and thank you for the very kind introduction. I'm so sorry I'm not in beautiful Lisbon with you, so I hope to come and see you in person before too long. I think when we think about the past and the present from the perspective of Europe, we have an assumption that the world we live in looks and feels normal. We sort of assume that because we learn about the great works of literature, of art and music and so on of Europe, that Europe leads. And if you take the long run of history, Europe's rise is both extremely recent and it's unusual. So if you go back 1,000 or 2,000 years, what mattered was not what happened on our end of the continent or end of the big landmass that connects Europe and Asia and Africa together, but it was what happened much, much further east. And a couple of examples that can remind listeners about that, taking them back to the classroom. When you learn about Alexander the Great, one of the greatest, maybe the greatest military general in history, when he wanted to conquer the world, he didn't head towards Lisbon and the Algarve and Faro and Porto. He didn't head towards Rome even, or to Munich. His sight was set exclusively on the Persian Empire and on the lands that went up as far as the Himalayas. And those networks that joined Asia together, both over land, but also by sea, brought things like spices and textiles and ideas and spread religions all around the world. Even our own religions that we're familiar with today, above all Christianity, we think of Europe as the sort of cradle of Christianity, exporting and evangelizing the Americas in Portugal's case, but also into Africa likewise and Southeast Asia. But Christianity and Jesus Christ didn't spring from European sources, despite the fact we have the Pope in Rome. Christianity spread from Nazareth, Jerusalem, and Bethlehem. And so too did Islam rise in Asia. So too did Buddhism. So too does Hinduism. So when we think, I think, about the past, we have to think quite carefully about what lessons we need to be thinking about to apply to the present day. Because from my perspective as a global historian, what has always mattered has been what has been traded and what has been moving along these corridors in Asia. And I think I remind for the Portuguese, the reason why Portugal built an empire around the world, had its own global empire, was because Vasco da Gama wasn't trying to be an explorer. He was trying to open up trade links and to connect Portugal closer to those markets in Asia. So even Portuguese at the time, at the end of the 1500s, at the end of the 1400s, knew that what Portugal needed to do to boost its economy, to have an intellectual stimulation, and to develop its culture was to have stronger links. And Portugal guarded its empire as carefully as everybody who guards empires does. And when that world has started to change, where empires have disappeared, then the world is starting to look to me a bit more familiar of how it did in the past, where geographies, connections, relationships, common values, and above all trade are what shape the world around. So from a historical point of view, it's nice to look back 1,000 years or more at the past and to see what was moving around caravans and how did people communicate, how did religion spread. But I think there are some very important lessons to understand the modern world, because the story of the last 30 years, certainly since the fall of the Berlin Wall, the global story has been about the rise of Asia. But it's happened at a time where we in the UK have been thinking only about Brexit and about the European Union. And most of us in Europe suddenly woken up in the last 1 or 2 years to think there's something strange going on. China is at the top of that list of things that are strange. And now we're reacting very late because we failed to understand the world around us properly.
We'll get into China in a moment, but why is this topic of the new Silk Roads and relating to the book that you published in 2018, the most recent edition, why is it particularly pertinent now? Not only because of China, but you talked about Alexander the Great. You look at history, and we can go back and look at the Ottoman Empire. You mentioned Persia as well, but this is a region of the world that has been in conflict for a long time, so it hasn't been able to flourish. Why is it important now to start linking what's happening in Europe to what's happening elsewhere? Because also, and we'll get into media also in a moment, but in our day-to-day lives, we are so consumed in what happens around us, physically and within our friends and our social media networks, that we kind of forget what's going on out there. So why is that relevant now, in your opinion?
Okay, so there are a couple of things. First, I'd pick up and say, these countries in Asia is a continent of empires, and empires have lots of negative sides attached. But one thing they do is they're quite good at creating large land masses and incorporating lots of people. We in Europe, our history is absolutely shaped by constant confrontation, constant competition. I mean, you look at the European Football Championships, there's a reason why European teams do better than other teams in the world, because we in Europe have competition being drummed into us from the beginning. So we codified all these rules. We find ways of fighting through peaceful means. And, so in Europe, there's a reason why we have small little countries like Luxembourg and Belgium and so on. And that's not what Asia looks like. These old empires have worked out quite successfully how to incorporate other peoples and to spread their tentacles. So I think that's a very important point, because it means the default is that we in Europe, our competitive edge, we have to work out and calibrate what it is that we're actually trying to do. Are we just competing for the sake of it, or is there a strategic plan? And that is one of the key differentials that we have between Europe, and I don't just mean the European Union, but other countries in Asia. So within the EU right now, and within Europe, including the UK, there's no real obvious direction of travel. There's no sort of real idea of what it is that we need. How do we solve problems together? But, we've got the loose stuff that works quite well, that allows you, when there's no pandemic, to fly around and to travel and to get jobs wherever you like. In Asia, it's a very different network of working out how to build infrastructure that will increase connections. And what is the long-term needs from a point of view of resources, from a point of view of demographics, and a point of view of climate. Some of those discussions, our world is going to heat up in the future, not because of recycling in Portugal or the unfortunate ways in which we burn fossil fuels in Europe or the United States, but to do with these mega populations in Asia. So in the world east of Istanbul, it's where about 65% of the world's population live. 496 of the world's 500 most polluted cities are in Asia. And some of these cities are of a scale that is completely mind-blowing and incomprehensible to us. So a city like Tianjin, which is not a particularly famous or well-known or big city, has an economy about the same size as Romania. Suzhou, another city, not one of the kind of cities that everybody mentions to start with, again, has a economy the same size as Austria. So these are enormous blocks of locations. And it's not just the China story, it's also an Asia story. The reason why this part of the world has been depressed and has been poor in the past and is rising so fast now is because, most of those resources were extracted and brought back to Europe. And as that age of European empire has changed, then these populations are galvanizing incredibly quickly. And so I know we're going to talk about China too, but for example, the case of Indonesia has a population where there are more than 200 million smartphone users, right? That looks to me like quite an exciting e-commerce trade marketplace for all sorts of things to be looking into. And they have, some of the internet businesses that are based out in Indonesia, market capitalizations in the tens of billions of dollars, but completely unknown to European and Western eyes, because we think of the world here in Europe and the US as the developed world and emerging markets. And we class all these emerging markets together. So Indonesia, Brazil, Angola, they're all put in one collective without disaggregating and working out why are some of these countries rising? What are the fundamentals that underpin it? And what is their direction of travel? What is their plan? What are their needs? And how can we cooperate, and can we cooperate with them? So that story of Asia's rise is one that is astonishing in its speed. So, for example, Europe's trade with Asia 20 years ago was worth about $2 billion a year. Now it's more than 10 times that sum. The scale of growth of Asian GDP, of control of GDP, was about 30%, very modest 30 years ago. And now it's above 55% and is projected, depending on which economist you want to listen to, but to rise to about 2/3, maybe even 70% of global GDP in the future. So the future of the world, its opportunities and also its challenges, are really not based in those cities that we learn about in the classroom, like London or Berlin or Rome, or those places that were really important and have a very proud history, and they've got a very important future. But the world looks to me much more familiar and similar to how it looked before those Europeans went out to go and explore and conquer other parts of the world. And those cities, I think, where decisions get made that really matter today will be in places like Riyadh and Tehran and Delhi and Manila, and countries that we spend almost no time thinking about because they're not part of our cultural, historical fabric. And that starts with education of young people, but runs through to chief executives and people who are running foundations, businesses, and making political decisions too.
Peter, thanks for adding context to this story and for at least helping me understand the landscape better and the connection between a lot of the work that was being done, a lot of the trade that was being done between superpowers in historical terms and what's happening now. Let's go to the specific case of China, because whoever we speak to here in our series of programs, whether they're experts in politics, in economics, in culture, in society, they all talk about this rise of China to the top. And I guess it's particularly, I don't want to say easy, but it can be explained also by the political model they have. When a country that size, that follows one leader, decides to do something, that whole machinery just turns its focus to it and moves forward with great speed. How have you seen the rise of China over the last 2 decades, and what did the pandemic do to it as well? Did it weaken it, or did it actually strengthen it from an economic point of view?
Well, it's done lots of things. There's no question that the way in which the pandemic arose and was dealt with by the authorities in China significantly weakened China's standing in the world and perceptions of China, and particularly in the developed, rich parts of the world. And there are very obvious and good reasons for that. The way in which authoritarian states are bad at information sharing, that they are always involved in cover-ups. There's an enormous amount of pressure for officials to not be able to make decisions and to delegate them higher up the food chain. And that is the fundamental weakness of any authoritarian state. And it was badly handled. And then with the way in which it was presented to the outside world, it lost China a great deal of credibility. On the other hand, one can look at things in a slightly different way to say, well, many of the people who are going for the banging on the China bandwagon right now and complaining and calling for action against China are using the pandemic and those contexts to get a wider audience to dig into the rise of China. So it's a kind of convenient handle in lots of ways. So China, in the last year and a half or so, last couple of years, its perception in public and in political circles was falling and had fallen quite sharply. So in one sense, the pandemic has accelerated something that was already happening, of people being scared of China and think it's not a trustworthy partner. That's how we see things in the West. Having said that, that's not how China is seen in its own backyard. So the ASEAN countries, the countries of Southeast Asia and of South Asia, with the exception of India, all see China not only as a reliable and a good partner, but one that's performed very successfully in the pandemic. There's a lot of respect of the way in which the process was dealt with after Wuhan had broken out, that China stepped in and did an okay job, but also a wider perception that China can't be avoided. It's not an elephant in the room. It has to be engaged with, and it's much better to build a positive relationship rather than moan about it. And that really begs the question here in Europe and in the United States, although we have all the suspicions about China, many of them rightly founded, what are we actually going to do about it in the final analysis? So you could look at it one of two ways, that here in the West, we see China, it's done damage to their credibility. It hasn't affected in the same way in Asia at all, which is fundamentally much more important for China. But I suppose if one were to step back from all of that, and it reminds us all what it's like in the playground, who cares what other people say about you? Tell me about the fundamentals. And China's exports for this quarter are 25% higher than they were before the pandemic. So China's economy has grown massively and has accelerated as a result of the pandemic because of shortages, because of imports. The single largest item by volume exported to the United States last year was furniture, because people trapped at home have been doing up their houses. That's been great for workshops in the Far East. And so China's economy has come out the other side significantly stronger than our ones. And because we in the West have intervened through government lending to businesses and to prop up businesses, we've taken on much higher levels of debt. So China not only has put its foot on the accelerator, or has been lucky to have its foot put on the accelerator, but it's also at the same time that's happened with a deceleration or some kind of impact on economies here in the West. So if you care about what people say about you, then it's been a bad time for China. If you're interested in fundamentals, which most people in business is to try to take the emotion out of it and to work out what are the more significant implications than whether people like you, because friendships can be built. And, China have been quite clumsy in lots of ways in their relationships with other parts of the world, with their neighbors as well as places further away. But it's quite clear to me that China has a general sort of plan. I think it doesn't have a master plan blueprint that some analysts seem to think that exists. But I think that China's muscles are growing, and that requires a great deal more thought on our part here about what does that mean for us? In what ways is specifically that a threat and a challenge? And in what ways does that offer us opportunities?
There's so many questions I have relating to this topic because it's so pertinent as well to our time and to the definition of the kind of balance of power between East and West and Europe's role. But they say, keep your friends close, your enemies closer. Which is the way that the West is looking at China, as a potential friend or as an enemy? And how does the United States, for example, or the EU or Great Britain manage this relationship, knowing they need them, but they can't get too close because they're a little bit toxic with their reputation and human rights abuses in the past and the authoritarian regime they have? How is the West managing this, in your opinion, Peter?
Well, they do it in the way that politicians in particular always do it. They say one thing and then they do another. So there's a lot of noise about putting the brakes on China. But as a very specific example, China has a very fractious relationship with Australia at the moment and has had blocks on key elements of Australian exports to China, particularly meat, but also coal. And China's responsible rather for such an enormous part of Australia's economy that has real significance of delays. And a lot of these things are not blocks or blockades or bans. What happens is you just make it harder to unload ships. You make the paperwork a lot longer and you tie up capital that way. And there's been a lot of noise around Western developed economies about how how China uses its muscles to get what it wants and to renegotiate or to negotiate better terms with Australia, which has politicians who keep talking out of school and talking out of line and antagonizing the Chinese. So Chinese daily newspapers have talked about the Australians in very derogatory terms, saying, they're like the gum that gets stuck to the bottom of somebody's shoe and won't go away. This kind of very, very high level of antagonism that is really hurting the Australian economy. The Australian economy, for example, because of the shortage of Chinese students right now, the main driver of fees for universities, has had to sack 18,000 university staff in the last year. right? So this is a really mega problem for Australia to be solving. The United States gives a great deal of support, but it turns out in figures released again very recently that the slack of the coal that's been blocked from Australia has been picked up by US coal suppliers. So America talks about blocking China, but in fact can't wait to fill its own boots quickly enough by encouraging American coal producers to ship coal to China. And again, we haven't mentioned climate, but the Biden administration has tried to make a big noise about climate being the main reason, not only the signature of his presidency, but also a key area where the US and China can cooperate. It's really important to have areas where there's no confrontation and both on the same side. So it might be that shipping coal right now into dirty factories, into dirty energy plants, may not be the best thing anyway. So the political rhetoric is about how China needs to be checked, how it needs to be stopped. But as a matter of fact, money always talks. And so politicians, I think, have got to line up their ducks properly. Are we just going to talk and make noises and do things, or are we going to take lower prices? And again, you in Portugal know that better than most countries in Europe, where you've had a relatively high level of attention from Chinese investment. Although in the grand scheme within the EU, it's tiny. You've had about 10% of the amount of money that's come into the UK. And yet Portugal quite often finds itself being discussed at EU by countries like Germany and France, which have both taken much, much higher levels of Chinese investment, saying Portugal shouldn't be taking money from Beijing. And regardless of is the experience, is it a good one, is it a bad one? The primary question is, if it's not going to come from Beijing, who is going to take a stake in EDP? Who is going to be buying stakes in Fidelidade? And in fact, would a stake in Fidelidade owned by a Chinese state-owned company, is that worse or better for Portuguese workers and Portuguese people who want things insured than being owned by a hedge fund in New York that might asset strip the whole company and load it up with debt? So, these seem that there's a simple answer to all these things, and politicians who have to, I'm quite sympathetic, really. Politicians have to deal in simple answers because they think voters don't understand things that are complicated, but these are difficult questions, and it's much better for politicians to at least be honest, but even better than an honest politician is one who's well informed. And so right now, the biggest problem I think structurally we have in Europe, in Portugal, in the UK, in the EU, and in the US is there are a lot of people with strong opinions, but very, very little knowledge. And, it won't surprise you, Pedro, to know 5 years ago, it was absolutely the other way around. Everyone was opening the doors and putting out a red carpet for President Xi to arrive and to attract Chinese investment. And now, although nothing obvious has changed, we're saying that needs to be stopped. And so, I'm not here to tell you what I think we should or shouldn't be doing, but I am here to tell you that if you're making decisions based on emotions and based on what you feel, you're less likely to get it right than if you use your brain and use your knowledge.
Yeah. You mentioned climate change, and actually want to close our chat on that. Before we do it, I have to mention, and I want to mention Russia as well. There are parallels with China, obviously, not only in the kind of political regime there, but in the increasing influence they have. How much is that actually tied just to one man? In China you have a system, but in Russia it seems increasingly to be tied to one man. And how do you see the role of Russia in not only the politics of Europe, but the economics of Europe, and how they will maintain their influence and their relationships with the West?
Well, I guess there are two ways you can answer that. One is as a historian. And so as a historian, I'd say that Russia has always been a weak great power. Russia has always had a difficult set of cards to play, but has played them relatively well. It's amazing that Russia, despite this global turbulence, despite wars, despite centuries of empires being built and lost, Russia is still more or less intact, despite bloody revolutions, despite the Berlin Wall coming down. Russia is still at the table in the game. And that deserves a bit of respect, I think, for understanding how Russia conducts particularly its foreign policy, but also that they're quite effective at running a state that is weak and disjointed. The challenge is that for looking at it as a political analyst today is that it's almost impossible to guess what happens after Putin. There are so many moving parts, so much happening under the bonnet, that it's almost impossible to tell. Putin sits at the top of a house of cards and also sits at the top of a lot of unbelievably wealthy, special interested individuals who are able to yank the state in the direction that they want and are quite successful at manipulating the political process in the ways they want as well. And so, again, one could take a view on that, which is either that Putin is still in place because he's power hungry and refuses to go, or there's no one else who's competent, trusted, and able to play that role. But any which way, I think in the kind of global picture, Russia, its corruption levels, its freedoms that have gone backwards, all those promises that we thought we would have from Russia at the beginning of the 21st century have evaporated, partly because Russia is finding it harder to play those cards and to play them successfully. You know, its invasion of Ukraine in 2014 was a total disaster and has been a strategic blunder as well as a humanitarian catastrophe, which, you know, again, called out Europe. We did nothing about it apart from writing newspaper articles. We didn't understand what was going on until it was too late. We didn't know what was happening. And now we're stuck where Crimea and Ukraine, Eastern Ukraine, seem to be under the Russian fist for the long term. But having said that, Russia have worked out how to play the rise of China quite successfully. So at the moment, we're looking at a world where it had looked like the big pipeline, Nord Stream 2, a big pipeline bringing gas from Russia into Europe that would bypass Ukraine, hugely important for Russia, not just because Ukraine has strategic rivalry, but also because the profits are much better if you can ship directly. It did look like that was going to get stopped. It seems that what's happening behind the scenes is that the US is trying to realize that Russia is holds a very important hand of cards in its relationship with China. And so there are moves right now to bring Russia in some shape or form back on side. The question will be, is it in Russia's interest to do that? Or will Russia slip into its traditional role of being quite disruptive, because it's much better to disrupt and stop other people getting what they want if you're never able to get what it is that you want yourself. And I think as a historian, that's how I'd see Russia's great success over the centuries, is that it's always found it hard to get its own way, but it's been extremely successful in stopping other people from having things in their direction. And that's statecraft and diplomacy, if you look at it coldly. But Russia clearly has a very important role in the triangulation with China. The question is the invasion of Ukraine, are the corruption levels, the freedoms of the press, the way that journalists disappear, political rivals get silenced, you know, Alexei Navalny, Boris Nemtsov, and so on, are those deal breakers? Or will we do what we often do, which is we write a rude letter, we wait a few years, and then we slowly, quietly forget about it? Is Russia strategically, is it worth our while to bring them back in despite what they've done? Or are we going to stand up for what we believe? And my guess would be that we would fold. And I suppose if you looked at it from that perspective, then the Russians got what they wanted. You know, they got Crimea, they got Eastern Ukraine, they managed to build the world in which they wanted their way, and they might so-called get away with it. But a lot will depend on what the breed of politicians we have. We clearly have more interventionist governments in Europe right now, partly because of the political mood, partly because of the rise of China, but also because of the levels of debt that the state has taken on because of the pandemic, which means that governments are going to play a much, much tighter role in monitoring corporations and businesses. And that may mean that we change the way we do things.
Peter, I'm going to have a couple of quick fire questions for you to finish the interview, but I do want to talk about climate change briefly. Everybody we talk to on this series of interviews raises the alarm about needing to do something now. Finally, at least living here in Europe, I get a sense that at least politicians and major influencers and decision makers are trying to take it seriously. How seriously is this topic being taken in China, in Russia, in India, in other countries that have more people and are doing more things at this time?
Well, the investment in clean technology in China is well leading at the moment in terms of patents, but also money that goes into it, partly because the three most climatically stressed parts of the world that will suffer most and fastest are the plains of northeastern China, South Asia, and South India rather, and the Middle East. And to some extent, each of these countries have different solutions. For Russia, it's quite clear that the Russian Academy of Sciences has produced works on what the impacts of climate change will be. And Russia will have some benefits as well as some challenges. And at the moment, the short term is that when the permafrost melts, pipelines move and then they crack and there are massive explosions. That's a major infrastructure problem of roads buckling and train lines collapsing and so on. But I think that the climate is being taken seriously, from what it's worth, as a global historian, what we should be doing is working out, if we can't stop it, if we're going to get warmer, what kind of steps should we be taking that are non-scientific? So there's a lot of people saying we should have interventions by governments to make us greener, cleaner, etc., and develop new technologies. That's great, but if those don't work, what are the things that we should be worrying about? Who's going to be migrating from where to where and when, and what should we be doing about that? What is going to happen with global food supplies? Where are they going to be stressed? And how should we be tackling those? So rather than saying the house is going to catch fire, let's call the fire brigade, what should we be taking out of the building while we still have a chance? What should we be working about? In fact, the big project I'm working on at the moment is a global history of climate change, because the climate has moved very dramatically in the past. There have been many periods where the temperature has dropped or risen by as much as 8 or 9 degrees. And you can see how ecologies respond to that, how animals and plants respond, and in some cases, how human beings too, when there are dramatic interventions that are sometimes to do with solar activity, sometimes they're to do with volcanic activity, sometimes they're to do with natural disasters of other kinds. So I think we should be paying a lot more attention to thinking about what that means for us in Lisbon. What does it mean if there are famines and food shortages? What should we be thinking about now in terms of provisioning, in terms of emergency responses? And I think we're all too easily taken on by the idea that if we go on protest and we say we should do something and hope that scientists or politicians come up with something that will save us. I mean, the truth is we burnt so much carbon in the 20th century that even if we stop and turn everything off today, we're going to keep on heating, because that's the way that greenhouse gases and carbon emissions work. It gets trapped, and it takes a while for the world to catch up. So it'll take a few decades anyway. So, I think we should have no illusions about how we need to change consumption patterns. But I think some emergency planning is not a bad thing to be thinking about too.
All right, our time is running out. I've got a few quick fire questions for you. So in just one sentence, and I know obviously all these questions could originate longer answers, but just in one sentence or in a few words. First of all, which is the most important message you share with your students every year regarding the balance of power between East and West?
I think read about the whole world rather than the stories that you've grown up listening to with your grandparents, because we're living in a changing world.
What feelings should we harbor for China right now as we speak? Fear, respect, awe, curiosity, or disdain?
I think that one shouldn't be optimistic or pessimistic. One should be pragmatic. One should assemble evidence, information, and make considered decisions rather than reaching for what you think or what you feel. So I would be pragmatic in the first instance. Okay.
And what is one personality trait a leader could really benefit from having, from your experience?
Well, it's a very, very good question. I'm not sure one line answer. Obviously, anybody would say that we want our leaders to listen to advice and to listen to as diverse advice as possible. In my experience, political bubbles around leaders tend to be extremely thin and very echo chambers, because leaders want to surround themselves by people who shield them from the bad news and make them feel better. But I think it's not a bad thing to be having diversity of thought, and that's a real challenge. Going to find people with different disciplines, different expertise, and getting them around a table is what I would want if I were to be a global leader.
Peter, it's been fascinating listen to you, your opinions, your ideas, your insight, your expertise. Thank you so much for coming on the program, and all the best. Stay safe as well, you and your family.
Thanks so much, Pedro. Thank you.
Take care. Peter Frankopan, na verdade uma conversa fascinante com este historiador global, internacional, e acho que aqui uma lição que podemos tirar desta conversa é o facto de, durante as nossas vidas, prestarmos tanta atenção àquilo que acontece à nossa volta, seja as notícias mais em Portugal, na Europa, no Oeste, que perdemos um bocadinho a noção do balanço do poder do planeta, quando muitas das grandes decisões e muitas das grandes influências da história da humanidade aconteceram em outros pontos do globo, seja no Médio Oriente, seja mesmo no leste do planeta. Portanto, algumas palavras, mais uma vez, de aviso para a influência da China, da importância da China na economia e na política internacional, e para prestar mais atenção, então, àquilo que acontece além fronteiras e noutras regiões do nosso planeta. Foi mais uma conversa fantástica aqui neste programa Impertinente, porque, como sabe, quando há factos, há argumentos.